robot voice interrupting me and reminding us all that this session is recorded, so please bear that in mind. There will be an opportunity to ask our panelists questions later on in the session, and we also welcome your contributions, thoughts, questions and interventions in the chat, so please make use of that as well. We'll try and get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Sir Gary Hickinbottom.
Thanks, Anne. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gary Hickinbottom. I chaired a Justice Working Party into government procurement, which reported in April. And I'll just today refer to just a few of the main themes that we saw in the course of our 15 months research. We researched into government services which had been contracted out, homelessness, benefits, adult care, prisons and immigration detention centres. And perhaps as you'll imagine, because of the nature of Justice's work, we focused on not on sort of competing commercial enterprises, but on the ultimate users, those to whom the services are provided, almost always in these fields, vulnerable individuals. Before I come on to these strands, the overarching conclusion that we came to was that there was an overwhelming picture that essential rights of those to whom services are provided are largely ignored, and that to remedy that requires a major change in culture, which puts the rights of the individual, the ultimate users of these services, at the heart of the procurement process. Just some of those strands that led us to that conclusion. The first was that outsourcing is not going to go away. We looked at these various areas. We looked broadly at some of the other areas of outsourcing. We thought about a third or a half of government services are now outsourced, and central government, local government simply don't have the experience or expertise now to take these services back in-house. And so we have to make outsourcing work because there is simply no plan B. We also saw that there was an obsession with cost saving at the expense of value and quality of service, and that was linked to a real hands-off approach by government at every stage, from pre-contract through contract initiation to implementation of contracts, management of contracts, and that was particularly so in challenging services. One of our witnesses said it was the principle of my mess for less, and it was also linked to a generally reactive approach, so that there was no real consideration of performance unless and until there was some form of disaster in the relevant area of service. And Brook House, which we'll hear from Kate later on, was a classic example of that. We saw insufficient accountability of both government and provider, and inadequate data collection that would enable any sensible form of proper accountability to take place, and we saw a fundamental lack of transparency throughout the entire process. So our conclusion was that this required a fundamental reset to ensure that the approach to procurement for these services was right-centred and responsible. So we made recommendations, 31 recommendations, but it included such things as initial, early and continuing engagement with those to whom the services are provided. Usually there is very little, if any, engagement with them at all during any part of this process, including recommended mandatory rights impact assessments where the risk to fundamental rights in the provision of any service is anything higher than very low. We advocated an emphasis on value as opposed to short-term cost, and we focused on clarification of responsibilities of the contracting parties, for example, in relation to human rights compliance, and effective methods of accountability. We recommended the proactive contract management of commissioning arms of government, and of course the general improvement of transparency. We also focused on the need to have an effective enforcement regime by or on behalf of these ultimate users that doesn't require, as the Procurement Act does, a £10,000 fee to go to the High Court, which is probably not very realistic if you're a homeless person or an immigrant detained in a detention centre. So we were looking at things like regulators, we were looking at things like Ombudsman. And just to emphasise finally, the overriding takeaway from this research, and that was that whilst governance and procedures, of course, are crucial, to remedy these problems requires a fundamental change of culture, particularly in government, which puts the rights of individuals at the forefront of procurement. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, and exemplary timekeeping, much appreciated. I'm going to move straight on to Kate Eves. Kate, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to present the relevant parts of the Brook House inquiry. So Brook House inquiry, for those of you that don't know, Brook House is an immigration removal centre located right next to Gatwick Airport. It holds between 300 and 400 adult men at any one time. None of the immigration removal centres are currently dealt with in-house by the Home Office. They're all contracted out to external providers. At the time of the incidents that I'm going to talk about, the provider was G4S. It's now a different provider, Serco. So there tend to be a small number of providers who operate within immigration removal settings to provide the services on behalf of the Home Office. The background to the inquiry, just very briefly, is a member of staff who witnessed what mistreatment that he was seriously concerned about, essentially went to the BBC to expose that mistreatment, and the footage that he then captured, which he recorded covertly, became the basis of a Panorama documentary, which was aired in September 2017, and the time period that was covered in that footage was April to August 2017. So we looked at a 5-month period for one immigration removal centre run by one contractor. The report was published in September 2023, made a total of 33 recommendations. Just very brief headlines in relation to how this kind of relates to the contracting out issues. I found 19 instances of mistreatment, which I found to be capable of amounting to mistreatment which would be contrary to Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The lawyers amongst you will appreciate the slight word salad that obviously an inquiry can't make findings on civil or criminal liability, but we also were required by our terms of reference to look at the individual instances of mistreatment that were exposed by that covert footage. Alongside looking at individual incidents, I also obviously looked at the bigger picture, some of the kind of thematic and systemic issues that were connected to those incidents of mistreatment. And so the 33 recommendations cover a full gambit of different issues. I'm going to focus on 2 of the recommendations, and these relate to the issues of contracted out services. They're very closely tied to a lot of the recommendations in Justice's report. So if you're reading the 2 alongside each other, you'll probably see that there are a lot of overlap. And once I've finished talking, I'll post a link to the report in the chat for anybody who hasn't had a chance to have a look at it. So Firstly, my recommendation regarding contracting was that I found that the Home Office needed to ensure that contractors were expressly required to comply with the overriding purpose of the underpinning rules of when you detain somebody for immigration purposes. So Rule 3, which requires a secure but humane accommodation of detained persons in a relaxed regime with as much freedom as movement as possible, consistent with maintaining a safe and secure environment. And the contract with the then provider just did not do this to anywhere near a sufficient degree. So that was kind of the overarching purpose of that recommendation. I also then found that the monitoring of the contract by the Home Office was just inadequate. So there was too much reliance on self-reporting without any apparent professional scepticism for underreporting and what might motivate a contractor to underreport incidents, and just no robust checks and balances in place to identify instances of underreporting. Part of that was including an entirely inappropriate over-reliance on arm's length bodies. So Gary mentioned the role of kind of ombudsman type functions and other oversight functions. So in this instance, I looked specifically at His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons and also the independent monitoring boards. But the over-reliance by both the Home Office, well, primarily the Home Office, but also on the contractor's part to rely on them to identify where there may be issues that needed to be resolved, was just inappropriate, and there wasn't enough responsibility taken on either side of that contractual relationship. I mean, in some instances, obviously, and this was the case for one of those oversight agencies, they didn't even have the contract available to them. So the concept of them being responsible for identifying where there were issues that indicated a lack of compliance is just kind of a nonsense, essentially. So just to give a little bit of colour to what I meant by some of that lack of imagination, I suppose, in terms of thinking about underreporting. So for the period that we looked at, we had 60 acts of self-harm, and the contractor reported that essentially none of those acts of self-harm were due to failures of the suicide and self-harm procedures that were in place, because that would have been the thing that tipped over into being a non-compliance issue and would have attracted a penalty. There was no process for the Home Office to actually check whether that was the case. So for 60 instances of self-harm, there just was no way to no adequate way to scrutinise whether that was really the case. There also was no attempt to kind of compare whether those figures actually whether that was favourable or unfavourable with other comparable sites. So did this mean that the contract was being delivered extremely well given the population or extremely badly given the population? There just didn't seem to be enough of a consideration mechanism in place to kind of pull that data together and make those comparisons, and therefore kind of identify where there might be red flags of issues. The Home Office didn't have the right staff at the right level with the right skill set and degree of understanding to monitor the outcomes experienced by the detainees. So in terms of thinking about the contract outcomes and what that meant for these individuals, there just wasn't enough understanding of that being a significant part of what they should be looking at. Concerningly, no penalties were attached to inappropriate use of force, which, and I don't know how familiar people will be with what the inside of an immigration removal centre looks like, but use of force, given the nature of immigration detention, and this is people at the very end of their process of trying to remain in the country and having failed, force is used. So I found that there was a vital gap in that kind of performance management piece, that this is something that is going to be used, and it's very important that there is a way to measure that it's being done appropriately, safely and proportionately and legally. So just for me, conscious of time, I'm just going to kind of make, for the rest of what I'd like to use my time for, I'm just going to make a few sort of broader brush observations, linking into what Gary said about kind of the experience of end users and perhaps the lens that we need to think about when we're thinking about particular groups of end users. So in the case of an immigration detention centre, I think of it in terms of the disincentives to identify problems. So the disincentives from the perspective of staff, and by that I mean staff actually there on the ground kind of doing the roles, and the type of culture and the type of environment that people are working in, and therefore the disincentive to kind of put your hand up and say, I think there's a problem, I think there's an issue here, I'm worried about whether we're really fulfilling what we should be doing. So there's lots of disincentives for staff. There's lots of disincentives for detained people. They're a very transient population. They have lots of language and communication barriers, which make it very difficult for them to understand and communicate some of the more nuanced things that they may need to be able to highlight issues in the way that get identified as contractual problems. You need staff who understand and can make the link between what people are telling them on the ground and what that actually means for how the services are being delivered. And they're also, obviously, they have great fear for the repercussions of what speaking out may mean for them on an individual and personal level. So I think this issue of engaging with end users and thinking about how they're affected, and both in terms of how contracts are monitored and being adhered to, but also how they're kind of constructed in the first place, is thinking about, there's a lot of information that we know out there about the experience of people in these particular types of settings, but there needs to be a bit of imagination used about how to engage with those particular risks and those particular issues for that group of people. Final just thought to finish on, as Gary said, just this issue of the kind of contracts attempting to kind of do more with less resource and the potential impact of that. You know, these types of environments are extremely challenging. They're very high risk. When things go wrong, there can be real serious harm done to people and groups of people. And so I think just thinking about what it actually means for the person at the end of that process. And for any of you who haven't seen much about the Brook House inquiry, there's a lot of footage on our website which actually shows what it looks like when somebody has force used against them in the process of being removed. So I think you can see actually it's quite a kind of powerful and visceral demonstration of where there was a problem and things weren't delivered in the way they were being. This is what it kind of looks like for the person that's experiencing it. And I will finish there. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that account. And lots to discuss there too. But before we get into the question and answer session, let's hear from our third panelist, Daniel Bruce.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daniel Bruce, the Chief Executive of Transparency International here in the UK, the national chapter of our Global Coalition Against Corruption. Just a bit of context about the report that I'm going to speak about this afternoon, and similarly, I will post a link to where you can find it online once I finish speaking. But just going back to that first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you will recall that there was a drip of allegations and concern in the media and elsewhere about the way that public money was being spent during the emergency. You know, you'll recall, I'm sure, some of the anecdotes around the former health secretary's pub landlord getting a PPE contract, early reports of seemingly shell companies bringing in PPE that turned out to be unusable. And we were concerned in 2021 and 2020 about this drip feed of concern about the way that government was procuring COVID materials, mostly PPE and some testing. And so we did an initial investigation using data up to the end of 2020, which we published in April 2021, with a very partial data set in terms of the whole amount of money that would then be spent by government throughout the whole of the pandemic. And so the report that I'm speaking about this afternoon tries to produce the most comprehensive analysis of corruption risk in public procurement and public spending through the whole of the UK government's pandemic response, taking that sample from the very early on in 2020 when things began, right out to the early months of 2023. And over that period, government spent just above £45 billion through public contracts and procurement, overwhelmingly on personal protective equipment, and some of that was on COVID testing materials as well. That 45 billion was made up by made up of 5,000 different individual contracts. And what we did in this research was we screened each of those 5,000 contracts against a series of red flags for possible corruption in the awarding of the contract or the way that the contract was spent and delivered. And we developed 14 indicators drawing upon best practice for the protection of public resources through public procurement developed by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. So the kind of things that we were looking for in this research were contracts awarded without any competition, the direct awarding of contracts, and that represented 2/3 of that £45 billion of public expenditure. Those contracts that were awarded to companies or individuals with significant political connections, and by extension of that, those which went through the very controversial VIP lane, which I'm sure you will have read about through coverage of this issue in the past as well. The VIP lane, which went on to be declared in 2 test cases in the High Court as being unlawful because of its incompatibility with the public contracting regulations. Other red flags that we were looking for, brand new or micro companies with no track record, companies less than 100 days old, companies with tiny balance sheets or no discernible assets. And of course, again, as has been much covered, companies that failed to deliver at all or produced unsuitable goods. And the most concerning examples that we found are those not just with 3 or more red flags in, but with up to 8 red flags in each of these individual areas. But the headline finding, which came out of our report in September, was that there were 135 of those 5,000 contracts had 3 or more red flags for possible corruption. Now, as a quantum of the 5,000, that's not actually huge, but then when you look at the actual value of public money spent through those 135, it's £15 billion of the £45 billion that was spent. So give or take 1 in 3. In that number, £1 billion worth of contracts where the PPE that was supplied was found to be unusable or was never delivered, 4 billion that went through the VIP lane, and £750 million going to brand new or micro suppliers. Why did this happen? I think there's enough evidence that has emerged through the early work of the inquiry, through our own research and that of others, that there were systemic weaknesses in the emergency procurement framework going into the pandemic. And to some extent, there have been attempts to address that through the new Act, with, of course, measures going live next year. But the government at the time then made a series of choices that allowed the state to function in a way that massively reduced the protections of public money, reduced the defences against the possible corruption of that money, rather than increasing them. Specifically on procurement, in terms of the recommendations that we've developed on the back of these findings, what we would like to see going forward beyond what's already in the Act, because we don't feel it actually does enough in terms of emergency procurement reform, far tighter controls on the use of direct award of contracts. Now, again, I will often hear the argument back around this that, well, you know, it was an emergency, people went to their mates, they did what they thought was safe, they just wanted to spend money and get the stuff in. But the use of direct contracting went on not just for many months, but it went on for years through this entire sample period, whereas direct award of contracts was rapidly abandoned by all of the EU 27, for example. So there has to be a far tighter emergency procurement framework built around that. Also, the emergency powers that were used, as matters stand, could just continue in perpetuity. And we recommend that there is an automatic sunset clause on the use of emergency procurement powers after 60 days, with any renewals justified to Parliament and with post-crisis reviews as standard. And a small nuance, which is really important for the transparency agenda here, is that the new Act increases the publication threshold for contracts to £5 million. We'd actually like to see that brought down to £2 million, because we feel that's a step in the wrong direction. And you'll see in the early sections of the report, if you haven't read it already or seen the headlines, but the first couple of sections deal with just the information chaos around public contracting. The very fragmented data sets, different codes being used for different departments across different procuring authorities. There are still to this day some significant COVID-19 contracts where we just don't know how much was actually spent and whether the products were delivered or not, because the information is still incomplete, or different records held by different parts of government are conflicting with each other. I'd just like to conclude by, again, responding to this point that, well, this was an unprecedented crisis. Government made choices. It had to do what it had to do. And of course, there's truth in that. And we certainly don't find a smoking gun. But what we do find is this collapse in the control environment with an already strained emergency procurement framework. We consulted with Transparency International chapters around the world and conducted other inquiries, and we didn't find any other precedent for the VIP lane that the government set up anywhere in the world. This seems to be completely distinct to the UK. Again, the UK continued with the direct awarding of contracts for months and years, and this was all sort of entrenched, and the public concern entrenched, through a complete collapse in public transparency because of the way that contracts were being published, often over a year late on the existing regulations. And as I said, some were still missing information and incomplete to this day. So there are 15 recommendations in the report. Some are around the accountability for what happened, but there's 135. We have submitted that list to the COVID-19 inquiry, in which we're a core participant. Procurement module opens next year, so I expect more scrutiny of the rearview mirror, if you like, on this topic going into next year. But we are also working through our public policy advocacy with various bits of government to advocate for the reforms, some of the reforms that I've described, and you'll find more detail of those recommendations again in the report, and I'll drop the link in the chat for that now. Thank you very much, Anne.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed to our panelists for packing an immense amount of food for thought into a very short space of time. We're now coming to our time for Q&A. But before I throw it open to our audience members, we've got 3 commentators who are going to each give a brief reflection on what they've heard and on their own experiences. So please do think about your questions while this part of the discussion is going on, because I will be throwing the floor open relatively soon. So our first commentator is Sally Morshead. Sally, over to you.
Hello. So I'm a housing solicitor and have been for quite a long time. And the two examples of really contracting out that we encounter are local authority reviews of their own decisions and local authorities taking advice from doctors for medical assessments. The two are different but related. I mean, the first is what you might call proper contracting out, where they have individual applicants for housing, for homeless in a homelessness context, have a right to a review of any negative decision pretty much, with a few exceptions, and they have to carry out these internal reviews. And they very often use there's about 2 or 3 different companies that different local authorities use. So there's that situation. Then there's other situations where they have to reach a decision about somebody's medical conditions and whether they're severe enough to give them a priority need for housing under the homelessness legislation, or priority under their allocation scheme for long-term social housing, or whether the housing they're in provided under the homelessness legislation is suitable. So those are 2 kind of quite separate things. The first one, the reviews part, I would say that it probably provides value for money for the local authorities, but it doesn't work in the interests of the applicants, because the impression we get is that they are very desperate to find against the applicants, and that's probably true of the local authority staff as well. So all this has to be seen in the context of local authorities having very little money. So they are really very keen to turn away everybody who comes to them. So they do this in the reviews when they're reviewing their own negative decisions by farming them out to independent companies who don't appear to be open-minded and seem to be even more keen than the local authority's own staff to find against them. It may be that the contract's less likely to be renewed if they reach too many favourable decisions, or if too many reviews succeed. Or it may even be that local authority staff are likely to be more sympathetic to individual applicants and their circumstances than staff employed by a private company, which doesn't have that day-to-day contact with homeless people. So that's the situation with review decisions. It's difficult to say that there's anything that they're doing routinely that's unlawful, but it's just that they're so obviously not impartial, and they have an end in mind, and that's what they're trying to do. So moving on to medical assessments. Now that's a bit different because it's not really contracting out. What it is using a medical advisor to give an opinion as to how bad somebody's medical condition is and how it affects them. So that's a valid use of medical experts. But what we find is that there's one particular company that is used, which I will name, called Now Medical. The doctors they employ are not specialists in the field of the client's or the applicant's medical complaints. They spend very little time on each report. I think their own figures show that, the numbers they take on. They don't contact the treating doctors of the individual applicants for their own opinions. They don't see the clients in person or speak to them directly. And the tone of the reports is such that it seems as if they're aiming to achieve a particular result, which is to turn down the applicant's request for housing. And in no way could they be seen to be independent or impartial. So, you know, there are various things that could be done differently. The assessment should set out whether the doctors are specialists in a particular field, any limitations in their findings. They should also provide reasons for not accepting the account of doctors who know these individual applicants very well. For example, colleagues have obtained reports from psychologists from organisations like the Helen Bamber Foundation, which about a client's mental health. And Now Medical report doesn't even engage with psychologist evidence or set out why the opinion differs. And similarly, clients with seizures who are under investigation, the reports say the medical issues are not of particular significance compared to the ordinary person if homeless. I'm not exactly sure how much time I have left. None, probably. Have I overrun?
It is pretty much time up, but I think if you've got one more concluding reflection, we can squeeze it.
I mean, I suppose the concluding reflection is that local authorities use these mechanisms, these contracting out mechanisms, as a way of preserving their own resources and turning people away. It's not very well regulated. They only get picked up on it when a lawyer gets involved, and only then if you can actually pinpoint an error of law, which is not always possible. And it just doesn't work. It's not a fair system, and applicants for housing are made to feel as if they are under investigation in a way that's inappropriate, when really they're just applying for something they need to meet their needs.
Thank you, Sally, for those insights. That's really helpful. Let's move on to Andy.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks to Gary, Kate and Daniel for very interesting overview of the three different reports. There's loads of things there. Goodness, there's a lot going through my mind at the moment, but the main things I would probably like to point out is firstly, there's a couple of mentions of contract monitoring and contract management. To me, it's pretty fundamental. It's been a problem in procurement, public and private sector, for as long as I can recall, that a lot of people spend much time setting up contracts and then don't spend so much time monitoring the contract performance. There's loads of models that you can use for this, but what is key is that there's a designated contract management resource plan and a clear contract management plan for the life of any particular contract, ideally involving both procurement and key stakeholders, technical leads. For me, there's two main themes for that. One of them is the focus on contract compliance. So if a contract's been awarded, making sure that it delivers what it's set out to do. And it's amazing how often you look back at contracts and people forget what they've contracted for specifically. And then there's virtually endless scope for betterment. By that, I mean improving the outputs, could be for the service users in this case, but improving the quality and level and volume of contract outputs and outcomes through the life of the contract. So the first thing I would say is contract management. I would bang that drum forever. Proactive contract management is essential. There's no point in letting and forgetting contracts because it won't end well in terms of performance. Second thing related, I suppose, is performance management. I work in government and we have a history of applying performance management regimes that are perhaps can lead to wrong or wrong incentives or wrong behaviours on behalf of suppliers and contractors. So, for example, we might apply some kind of service level and credit regime. So if a service isn't delivered in full or isn't delivered to the right quality, there might be some kind of deduction system. More recently, our organisation, a number of colleagues in procurement are exploring incentive-based performance management systems. So the principle that the contracting authority would pay for the core service if it's delivered fully, but to have the potential for paying more for value add. So what achieves greater outcomes, perhaps for the users of the service or for the contract in general. Another thing is I'm somewhat alarmed when I hear that in this day and age we're awarding contracts in some instances on lowest price. I'm not suggesting it's perfect in Scotland, but we have local legislation, the Procurement Reform Scotland Act, that for all regulated procurements, contracting authorities are obliged to award contracts on a best price quality ratio, so balancing quality with price. That's a default position on any contract. I appreciate when there's a pandemic going on, that might have been difficult to do for authorities for all the reasons Daniel's touched on. But I would strongly advocate that any significant government contract should be awarded on a BPQR, not just a lowest price basis. They're probably the main themes for me, Anne, at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andy, for those reflections. And then our final commentator before I throw this open is Michael.
Hello, thank you. So local government and social care ombudsman, final destination for complaints about councils and privately commissioned care, deal with about 18,000 complaints a year, detailed investigations into around 4,000. We tend to see everyday injustice rather than kind of some of the abuses that we've talked about, but we do see systemic failures around commissioning leading to enduring injustice for many. In every case, we hold the council, the commissioning council, or the care provider to account. So however the service is delivered and by whomever, the responsibility comes back to the council that we hold to account. And we expect councils to learn lessons from our upheld complaints of where we find maladministration or service failure when they retender and when they recommission. So the work Gary and others and Philip have done is really helpful in that respect. We see a real mix of experience across services as diverse as waste collection, special educational needs provision, where the private sector is getting more and more involved, home to school and transport as well, fostering agencies, disabled facilities grant, the full gamut of services that local government provides. 4 takeaway points for us, I would say, for this work. Firstly, instances of public bodies abdicating responsibility. So, for example, around disabled facilities grants, where framework agreements governing the commissioning of private organisations to deliver grants, examples where the council is abdicating responsibility for supporting vulnerable people through the process who want to complain about poor quality, not being signposted even to the council, let alone to us. Secondly, an accountability vacuum, where care providers who are providing personal care on behalf of the council, which is the commissioning body, not embedding staff training, staff competency checks in the procurement process, just not giving adequate oversight of that where things go wrong. Fourthly, inadequate quality assurance. So examples around simple things like invoicing correctly for domiciliary care, where a private provider is repeatedly making mistakes, causing distress, causing upset, causing frustration for the service user who is having to make repeated inquiries of the council to act on their behalf, where the provider is just not addressing the issue. And fourthly, and a real interesting parallel here, I think, with what Kate was saying from a completely different end of the spectrum, but overzealous target-driven enforcement agents acting for the council, so a private company carrying out enforcement action to collect fines, etc., where the contract is incentivizing or not sufficiently controlling, incentivizing numbers above quality and customer care, and actually ensuring a values-driven approach. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. We have some time now for questions. Please raise your little yellow hand if you have a question, or you can drop it into the chat. And please keep the questions brief and focused. Janet.
Hi, I'm Janet Phillipson from HM Prison Probation Service in England and Wales. So a couple of questions. One is the thoughts of in particular, the first two panelists around how we kind of balance making sure that we are monitoring and checking on all of these kind of services, etc., with having a more outcomes focus and more innovation, where we don't want to necessarily spell out every little thing in the contract. And the other is around, to what extent do you think having a standard profit cap would minimise some of the issues, in particular talked about by Daniel in terms of the kind of corruption, but also actually some of the wider issues in terms of who we get contracting and what their incentives are. Is it money or is it, social value, for instance?
Great questions. Thank you very much indeed. We'll collect up a few and then give our panelists an opportunity to respond. Any other questions? Oh, it's looking a little bit quiet. You have to put up with questions from me if you don't come forward. Yeah, here's a couple coming now. Stephen Parker.
Oh, hi there. It's Steve from the Open University. Just interesting to hear. I think it was Sally, was talking about more of the, the individual sort of user, or whatever the correct term was, but also we get quite a lot of technical language. And I don't know if anybody got any sort of comments about how we might sort of connect that sort of very relational, small scale, almost emotional perspective of the individual user with the higher level technical sort of processes. Something I think about myself a lot, but if you've got any comments on that, I'd be really interested in hearing them.
Great question. Thank you, Stephen. I think I saw Chris Eucons waving. Chris, was that a question?
Help, I'm in America. So the question I had is, as you're doing, as in the UK, as you're doing oversight for public contractors, we're just turning the corner here in the United States on beginning to decide whether or not procurement administration data should be publicly available. Has there been pushback from industry saying, no, this is all proprietary, it has to be sealed up? Because that's the answer in the United States. All performance information is proprietary and should not be made public.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great question around availability of data and what we can do with that. Rory?
Somewhat related to that, I was curious about the panelists' enthusiasm for the new Procurement Act, which goes live in February. Under the new Procurement Act, there's something called the Procurement Review Unit. How confident are you that the Procurement Review Act is taking on board some of your recommendations, and how enthusiastic are you that they will be able to do their job?
Also a great question. And I'll throw in one from me as well. I think Gary mentioned right at the end of his comments the idea of putting a culture of individual rights at the heart of procurement. And I think I wanted to know a bit more about how we might go about that, what the mechanics of that might be. And also whether you feel that that's just a wider problem in government or something that is very specific to procurement. Is this an area where individual rights of service users are particularly easily overlooked or neglected? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is go back to each of our panelists in turn to tackle as many or as few of those questions as they like, and maybe to offer concluding thoughts on what they've heard overall from each other and from our commentators. I think you've probably got about 4 minutes each for this session, if that's okay. And we'll go back round in the same order. So Gary, it's over to you first.
No, thanks, Anne. Just to deal with that last point, a very good point as to whether this focus on rights is peculiarly a matter for procurement, or whether it's just across government. I think why there's a peculiar focus in this particular area is because in the provision of government services, normally those to whom the provision is made are particularly vulnerable. I mean, that's why they require services. So you're talking about people in prison or otherwise in custody. You're talking about homeless people, people on benefits. Virtually everybody in receipt of these services are particularly vulnerable. And I think that's why it's so important that procurement in respect of these services is focus on individual rights and individual interests. In terms of the Procurement Act, not many comments, but I think just the one comment. I think simply the Procurement Act it gives the mechanics perhaps for a cultural change, but a cultural change is not necessary under the Procurement Act. So it sets up a structure in which cultural change can happen. But I mean, for example, in terms of enforcement, it doesn't really grapple with that, because the main means of enforcement is to go to the High Court and pay a fee of £10,000, and that method of enforcement is simply not appropriate for the sorts of rights that we are particularly focused on.
Great, thank you. Kate, any conclusions, responses to questions from you?
Yes, thank you. I'll maybe sort of tackle that first question about getting the balance between it's not having to spell out everything in the contract, but also kind of having enough of a robust monitoring approach. And so two things kind of spring to mind, I guess, when I think about Brook House specifically. So one of the processes that I was critical of in the inquiry was the whistleblowing process for staff, which appeared to be set up based on the other types of settings that particular contractor had more experience with. So the type of whistleblowing process that you might set up if you're talking about people working in a warehouse or in call centres or in settings other than a detained secure setting, where the types of risks and the types of issues and the types of things that people might need to whistleblow about and the risks associated with that whistleblowing are very different. So I think there is something about, yes, absolutely, I accept that, you know, by contracting out the service, you don't want to have to monitor every single kind of dotted I and crossed T. But I think there's something fundamental in those kind of very early phases of constructing the contract, that every area that you look at is going to be dictated by the specific need. I think you said you're from the prison service, so I presume you're kind of thinking it in the same kind of way, that you're thinking about it in a kind of setting that is not like other settings. And so the risks that are associated with not having the right type of safeguards are very different to that they would be for all other types of services that may be contracted by that one provider. So I think it's about very early kind of cultural engagement with what it is that you're bidding for, and therefore the type of issues that you need to kind of consider as you build in all of those things like whistleblowing, complaints, all of the things that you're going to need to look at, and then making sure that there's enough understanding at the right level of how you actually monitor. Okay, you might have the right system, but how do you monitor the outcome of that system? Because just allowing it to work without looking at the outcomes, are people using the whistleblowing system? Why aren't they using the whistleblowing system? If they're not, then those are the kinds of things that you need to be constantly vigilant about. And that's my kind of main reflection on that.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Any final reflections, conclusions, responses from Daniel?
Thanks again, Anne. I'd actually like to start with just a point that was raised in the chat earlier about the sort of evidence base or lack of, despite this kind of 4 years of inquiry on this, of specifically bribes or facilitation payments having been paid to get COVID contracts as a form of corruption. And I think here one of the important things to consider is the wider definitions of corruption, and the sort of accepted parlance in the TI world is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, which of course can involve solicitation of bribes, but it can take other forms as well. And it's helpful to reflect in this scenario who actually has the power in this situation. And I would contend that in many cases where you saw politically connected individuals being able to get access to the VIP lane and get that early triage before the formal procurement process kicked in, that they were in a unique position of power to offer their goods and services in a way that others weren't. And we often heard of those cases where there were actually very reputable, long-standing suppliers who were trying to help government and wanted to be able to help, but couldn't because they didn't know how to make their offers. They didn't know how to get into the system. And some of those politically connected individuals in our sample, and we haven't published the full sample of 135 because it's very difficult to go through right to reply with 135 case studies. There are some named case studies in the report, but there are others which I have to refer to in genericized terms. But some of those politically connected individuals were donors to the party of government. And therefore, they're in a position of power because they can take something away politically if they so wish. And so there are lots of nuances in what the sort of the corruption risk looks like in some of these cases. It's not as straightforward as whether or not a bribe was paid. Couple of other quick responses to points of discussion. I mean, I think there are just some parallels here on the point which has come up a number of times over the hour in contract management. And we've looked, of course, a lot at the contract award process, but a lot of the failures afterwards were again failure to deliver. And that speaks again to that point of the insufficient balance between where the due diligence has happened. The price cap question. Yes, we have made reference to this in some of our procurement recommendations in the report. That's based upon some analysis that you'll find in one of the annexes to the report around the significant change in the profit margin of some of the case studies that we have named and looked at, where you can see the massive growth in which one can take a view on whether that was appropriate or not, but the data rather speak for themselves. Finally, on the Act, I mean, our position on this is that, it's job begun, it's not job done. And I think it would be unhelpful if the new government felt that that was all done and dusted and that the review unit alone is going to fix everything. All of the recommendations in our report on procurement post-date the Act, and again specifically point to, I think, disappointing attention to procurement for emergencies when we will face other large-scale emergencies at some point, whether on a sub-regional level, so for example like the flooding that we're seeing, or another pandemic or something else. So work still to be done there, most certainly, but I think it is a big step forward in the right direction when it comes to the cleanliness and consistency of data, which again at the start of our report we found was a bit of a minefield. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I commend to you all three of the reports that our speakers have been talking about. I've read all of them, and they're really very interesting. There's a lot of rich learning in there, and some shocking examples of poor performance too, which I think we'll need to be aware of and thinking about and trying to learn from for the future. So I think lots of great suggestions around process and following process, around culture and improving and developing culture, thinking more clearly about accountability, particularly in the contract management space. That's something we come back to time and again, don't we? That is a major issue that is under-resourced, under-invested in. And options, I think, for making better use of data to really shine a light on what is going on. So I've learned a huge amount from this session today. I hope you've enjoyed it too. And a massive thank you to our panelists and to all our participants, all those of you who've asked questions, contributed in the chat and so on. to make this a really interesting and valuable session. Thank you all very much indeed. Rory, I don't know if there's any housekeeping or anything else that you would like to wrap up with just in the final couple of minutes.
If you're not already part of our POGO list, please do sign up. The Oxford POGO Club is even more fun than it sounds. Procurement of Government Outcomes. You're all very, very welcome. Thanks for attending this. There will be some more sessions in the new year, including a session around the go live of the Act, which happens at the end of February. Also, we will be returning to our international focus and have more sessions that will be more relevant to our international group. This has been an excellent session. Thanks again to Philip for setting it up, and to Anne, our chair. Thank you.